American Innovation, How Venture Capital Impacts Defense. Please welcome co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Alley, Morgan Brennan, and our distinguished panelists.
All right, good afternoon. Hope everyone had a good lunch. Ready for more discussion here today. I'm going to introduce our panelists. To my right is Lisa Hirschman, Acting Chief Management Officer for the U.S. Department of Defense. We have Mike Brown, Director, Defense Innovation Unit. Peter Thiel, co-founder and partner, Founders Fund, co-founder and chair, Palantir Technologies. And Josh Wolf, co-founder and managing partner of Lux Capital. Thanks for all being here today. I just want to make an announcement that for those in the live audience and also those that are viewing around the country on the live stream, you can submit questions via the RNDF app or via Twitter at #RNDF. We're going to be leaving some time at the end of this discussion for those questions, so go ahead and submit them anytime during the next 45 minutes. And with that, we'll get started. So the topic of this panel, I think it's a pretty good one, especially given the conversation that we've been having for quite a while now. Harnessing and securing American innovation, how venture capital impacts defense. Lisa, let's start with you. Your thoughts on that. How does venture capital impact defense? Does it?
It absolutely does, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to continue to drive public-private partnerships. I will tell you from the Office of the Chief Management Officer, one of the things that we look to on an ongoing basis is how is industry doing things? How do we benchmark ourselves? What can we learn from their approach and apply it at the Department of Defense? So I think there's great opportunity here for us, especially as we're watching tighter budgets and making sure, as we heard from Secretary Esper, at lunchtime in his keynote, that we are mindful of every dollar that we're spending and is it for high return. This is a great opportunity for us to engage with venture capital money, leverage that money, and look at the high and long-term return that we can offer to VCs.
Mike, I'll put the same question to you, especially given the fact that you do run the department's Defense Innovation Unit, and you are basically the liaison between the tech community, Silicon Valley, and the DoD.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with Lisa. It's absolutely critical that we have close relationships with early stage technology. More and more of what the department needs going in the future is dual use technology, which means it's equally or more important in the commercial space as it is for the military. So we got to leverage what's going on with the tremendous innovation hubs that we have around the country and make sure those companies feel like they're thinking about Department of Defense. When you work talking about areas like AI or cyber, we need those companies and their technologies more than they need us. So we have to make sure that DoD is easier as a customer to do business with. Secretary McCarthy talked about that in the panel, about that's what he's trying to do with Army Futures Command. We're trying to do that across all of DoD. I think we're the organization that has cross-DoD capability and the only one exclusively focused on commercial technology. So absolutely critical.
Yeah, Peter, you could probably count on one hand how many companies, startups are out there in the country right now that are focused on national security in some form or fashion and that have reached so-called unicorn status, meaning $1 billion valuation or greater. I believe you've funded all or nearly all of those companies. How do you think about this?
Well, by my count, the number is 2. If we look at companies started since the end of the Cold War, last 30 years, 1989 to 2019, they're SpaceX and Palantir. I was co-founder of Palantir, and I was the first outside investor in SpaceX. So I've been heavily involved in both of those. And I think there's always sort of like a glass half full, glass half empty version. The glass half full version is that I think innovation will get driven by a lot of innovation gets driven by smaller companies that get started and that scale over time. And so this is absolutely critical. When not that many people are doing it, if you're one of the few who does it, there's a lot of opportunity. And then at the same time, we have to acknowledge that in the aftermath of the Cold War, there were sort of ways in which the military contracted into the sort of posture where all the funding went to the major primes, and it became much harder for this sort of small to mid-sized entrepreneurial system to build. And I think as a venture capitalist, you don't want to invest in tiny consulting companies that always stay tiny, and that where there's some idiosyncratic use, and it sort of goes into a cul-de-sac that's a broom closet in the Pentagon or something like this. You want to do things that scale, that get bigger over time, and this has sort of been, and I think there's definitely a lot of there are a number of attempts been made in recent years in the U.S. military to try to correct for this sort of procurement process, but I still think we have a ways to go.
Josh, you're invested in a number of companies as well. They're focused on national security and defense. How do you see it as an investor, and are there those opportunities beginning to emerge now to grow and to scale, especially at a time where so many other VCs are focusing on companies that are consumer-facing or enterprise-facing, given the fact that those do tend to be big growth areas?
There definitively are opportunities, and I want to echo something that the SecDef said, which was that it's about the people. And so if you start even with the motto here of peace through strength, strength in part comes from technological dominance, and technological dominance in part comes from brilliant engineers that are inventing the most cutting edge technologies to outcompete peer competitors. And so if you spend time with somebody like Palmer Luckey at Anduril that you may have seen walking around the halls, or Trey or Brian, these are authentic engineers that are obsessed with technology, that are constantly thinking about what does the warfighter need, where's the white space, what's the gap, what is China developing, what is Russia developing, and how can we equip them with the most cutting edge technologies that are out there. And so if you go with the cliched view that the best way to predict the future is to invent it, the people that are inventing the future are the engineers that are really toiling and doing some of the most cutting edge work. Many of those people are inspired by science fiction. They are literally going back 20 years into the annals of comic books and sci-fi movies and saying it would be amazing if we had that. And by the way, when you speak to top military brass, they say the same thing. T2 Tony Thomas said, when he was in Afghanistan, he wanted the Minority Report like gloves to be able to navigate through information space. And I think when you talk to all top warfighters, they're saying, we want the stuff that we see in the movies. Well, the people that are inventing that are these young entrepreneurs and these young cutting-edge engineers. And I agree 100% with what Peter said. I think we have a totally flawed system where you have people that feel in government like they are checking the box by allocating a little bit of capital to many projects. And they're doing the country and these companies, frankly, a massive disservice. We don't do that, right? As venture capitalists, we don't put $250K or $500,000 into 100 companies. You really try to double down on who are the best teams developing the most cutting-edge technology, and you really put a fewer number of eggs in fewer number of baskets. So I think if there's one thing that we could change, it would be really to concentrate bets into the absolute best to give not only these companies an advantage, but to give the country an advantage.
So you just touched on something. I want to just flesh this out a little bit more, because when we were getting ready for this panel, one of the points that was raised was this idea that maybe folks that are involved in military work or in the defense community don't fully understand or fully know what it means what venture capital investment means. So just my quick elevator pitch, a little background here, that a venture capitalist is an investor who provides capital to firms that exhibit high growth potential, as we just talked about, in exchange for an equity stake. VCs target firms that are at the stage where they are looking to commercialize their idea. High risk, high reward. You can see high rates of failure due to the uncertainty that is involved with new and unproven companies. I read one stat that's something like 70% of startup companies tend to fail.
It might even be higher. I mean, if you think about our world is much about frequency versus magnitude. In military, you of course can take significant calculated risks, but the consequence of failure is much greater. 90% of the things that we fund could fail. If the 10% that succeed in such a magnitude, that it makes up for all the losers. And so we are willing to take, and our investors that give us money, pension funds and endowments and wealthy families, expect that exact risk taking. They expect us to invest in things that are going to create multi-billion-dollar future businesses, and they're totally okay if the long tail of other stuff that we fund, ends up being absolutely worthless.
Yeah, but the corollary to that that's very important to draw out is if you can't create a business worth $1 billion or more, the venture capital model does not work that well. So if you start a company and it's worth $30 million, $100 million, that can be quite successful for the person starting a company. For a venture fund, that actually, if that's the best we did in any of our companies, we would be out of business. So you need to get some that can really break through at scale. And so it's not, we're not investing in hot dog stands, which could be a great business, but is not going to scale. We invest in companies that start small, but have the potential to grow and scale to sort of a world-class scale.
Which begs the question, I think, because you just mentioned Palantir and SpaceX. Certainly SpaceX is changing the way that rockets are flown. Has it created, or have these companies created a template for other startups to follow within the space?
Well, there's certainly proof that it can be done. It in both cases took a wickedly long time, probably close to a decade, to start getting significant contracts from the U.S. military, and in some ways they were not conventionally venture fundable. I personally funded Palantir. Elon personally funded SpaceX. We got outside capital maybe six years in to both businesses. And so if you have something where you have a 6-year gap and it can only get funded by someone who's putting in tens of millions of dollars as a sort of slightly quixotic project, that's a tricky template to repeat. So I think there definitely are lessons one can learn from Palantir and SpaceX. We made a lot of mistakes. There may be ways to sort of develop these things more quickly, to procure things somewhat faster. But if you have a decade-long process, we're supposed to have long time horizons, but the time horizons are not that long.
The one thing I will add that I think is a tremendous testament to both those companies and Anduril and others that are fast growing and now have momentum is the people that are attracted to high growth, really big historic narratives. And so if you think about the flow of talent, the flow of human capital, the flow of financial capital, they don't want to go into these small hot dog stands or these $30 million businesses. But when you see people voting with their feet, and I in no way mean to offend any of the primes who do incredible work, but many of the top engineers are saying, I don't want to go to, for example, Lockheed, which is one of my investors. They want to go to some of these high growth early companies where they see the opportunity to create a fortune and a future as much more attractive.
All right, I want to dig into that comment a little bit more, but first,
I just want to add, I think this is one of the roles that DIU can play, because while there have been very successful companies with high valuations that have focused on the defense market, we equally want to look for companies where defense can be a vertical that they're pursuing, but we got to make it easy enough for those companies to want to do business with us and have a successful business on the side. So in the spaces, especially of AI and cyber, where there's more commercial opportunity than there is with DoD, we're going to make sure that's a natural way of doing business. We're working with a company in the AI space helping us do predictive maintenance, who had a very successful commercial business, never thought about defense, and through our efforts now has a successful defense business. So that's another model relative to SpaceX and Palantir that we want to see much more vibrant.
And I think to that point, it's incumbent on us, and I'm going to go back to the ETDBW, easy to do business with, that we remove those barriers to entry and we make it easier to access, easier to understand what our requirements are. And we need to scrutinize our own level of requirements and say, are they necessary? I've talked to members of the industrial base, small businesses, who psych themselves out before they've even started. And so they just, no, if I've heard about this, it's too hard, not going to go there. We need to change that, and we need to also, one of the areas that I'm focused on is bringing concepts from the agile industry, which is where I came from right before DoD, and think about taking risks, failing faster, minimum viable products, getting things turned quicker, learn from them, and keep going, that will engage these businesses and have a better outcome. So we have to be a friendlier partner.
I think Mike makes a great point in the liaison role that he's playing for some of the emerging technology companies and DoD, and it's a really critical one because it helps to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce a very key risk, which is market risk.
Yeah.
So if you think about all the risks, we have national risks, be it China, Russia, non-state actors, and you have warfighters that want technology, and then you have investors that are willing to take the risk to fund that technology. We're thinking about people risk. Are we backing the right people? Technology risk. Will the thing work? Competition. But a key risk is market, and you will have a lot of venture capitalists that say, oh, you're focused on the defense industry. Okay, what are the stereotypes? Obviously, stereotypes have elements of truth. It's slow moving. It's bureaucratic. It's very political. They might not pick the best technology. They're going to give it to this prime that they've been working with for 20 years. And so whatever you can do to eliminate that risk, it's sort of like as a country, we're fighting with ourselves by not equipping the warfighters with the absolute best technology that is coming from some of these early companies.
Lisa, I think that begs the question then, and certainly we've heard this discussion of reform, and Defense Secretary Esper touched on it earlier today as well. Does the acquisition process as it currently exists, the contracting process within the DoD, enable the companies that have the best technologies to be able to actually win contracts and actually be able to work with the DoD?
It's certainly a factor, and it's a big part of our reform initiatives. And I must say that we've got some very engaged partners within DoD. Undersecretary Lord from Acquisition and Sustainment, Undersecretary Griffin from Research and Engineering, and the military departments as well, looking at how do we leverage this approach. So we've looked at acquisition reform, but we're also looking at, as an aggregate to that, or I should say, in addition to that, the overall management of contracts. And it's fundamentally changing the way we do business. We have over 40,000 contracting officers and 2,500 contracting offices. And so being able to manage that, even internally for our own people, sometimes that's untenable to manage. So we have to fix that. We need to make sure that we are in lockstep with what the acquisition teams are driving in reform, and that helps, again, remove those barriers to entry.
All right, I want to bring up a graphic here. I actually cited this on TV yesterday too, because I think it's a really, interesting graphic. This is from Gavini. This is the U.S. share of global R&D investment. 1967, as you can see right here, it was a little over 60%. A big chunk of that was DoD related. Obviously, the USSR also made up a significant size of the global total. And as you see it move through the next several decades and over the next 50 years, you get to 2017, and the U.S. is less than 30% of global R&D spending. And look at what's happened with China. It's jumped, and it's become a larger share of the global total than the USSR was during the Cold War. We were having this question before we got on stage, and Peter, I'll send it back over to you. How much is the need for new innovation, new technologies, the way you're thinking about funding companies and starting companies right now, how much is that being driven by the China discussion?
Well, I think the China dynamic has changed things tremendously in the last few years, where in the 90s and maybe still in the 2000s, we thought the Cold War was over, and there was sort of a way we could proceed on where it could be slower. You could go with the bigger primes, things like this. I think China is going to force us to compete, to think much harder how we can deploy technologies much faster, and so I think it's changed the dynamic tremendously. I think we have a serious space race with China. We have a serious AI race. I've complained in the past about Google's what I think very problematic decision to pull out on the Project Maven, the AI project with the U.S. military, and to continue to work with China, which I think is sort of a shocking, unprecedented thing for a major American company not to work with the U.S., but indirectly to work with our geopolitical rivals' military. But I think sort of the silver lining of the Maven controversy is that it tells us that AI is a military technology, or at least it's a dual-use technology. And it's not something that Silicon Valley had acknowledged for a long time. And I think it's sort of very different when you think about the debate we had about nuclear weapons in the 1940s, where it was clear it was dual use, and you had a debate, and there were scientists like Oppenheimer who were against, and Teller were in favor, and you had sort of a debate. And we haven't had this debate, and I think even though I disagree with Google on Project Maven, and I think it has forced a debate, and that sort of debate about AI is going to happen in many other areas of technology. They are dual use, and we better make sure we get the cutting edge ones on our side.
Do you think Silicon Valley or the rest of Silicon Valley has woken up to that fact? Do you think that's a Google-specific situation, or do you think it's a bigger, broader issue debate? It's certainly been framed around this idea of ethics, for example, employees not wanting to work on military-related projects. Do you think it's Google-specific, or do you think it's more of a bigger, broader culture?
There are things that are specific to Google. There are things that are more general in Silicon Valley, where it has sort of it's very disconnected from the history of the 1950s and 1960s, where Silicon Valley was heavily created by military R&D, and people are just not aware of that history in any way. I think the Seattle companies, Amazon, Microsoft, are probably somehow better than the Silicon Valley companies on this, and so there's some cultural differences between Seattle and Silicon Valley. But even in Silicon Valley, you talk to people, and there is sort of a recognition that something's very different. I would push back on the ethical framing. I think that when it's a choice between the U.S. and China, it is always the ethical decision to work with the U.S. government, and it's very, even though we don't know all the unethical things that are going in China, they're sort of often hidden and obscured. That's a much more problematic ethical one, and so it's really odd that we're having any sort of debate where that's even framed as a question.
Silicon Valley has this mythology of being a bunch of fruit orchards, and then suddenly Hewlett Packard gets formed in a garage. But the origins of Silicon Valley were in electronic warfare and defense. And I do think, while it's not necessarily ethics in many cases, that there is an aversion for people to want to work on defense-related things, and that is a zeitgeist that is growing. I do think an element of that is some of the companies, pandering to the lowest common denominator and wanting to avoid, HR issues and controversies. But I think another part of this, and this is a conversation I had with Brigadier General Braga in PACOM in Thailand, Philippines. The idea that in the 80s, when I was growing up, we had a clear and present danger, in Soviet Russia, and it was a narrative that rallied people together, and it was everywhere. I watched WWF wrestling. You had Hulk Hogan and you had Nikolai Volkov. You had Rocky and you had Drago. You had Red Dawn. And today,
great movie, by the way.
Today, you would be hard pressed to find a Chinese villain. And some of that is for economic reasons. Hollywood does not want to insult one of its biggest markets. And some of it is ownership and other acquisition decisions that China has made quite strategically. But that affects the narrative and the zeitgeist of young people growing up in the country and the things that they value. And the good thing, I think, in the 80s and early 90s, you had an influx of Russian immigrants that were so pining to be American, that so wanted to raise the American flag and be part of it. There was no question of them going back to their country. And now I think there's a big influx of immigrants that either they're not welcome here, which is a problem, or they go back, and the transfer of intellectual property and knowledge is very porous. And I think that there's a job society can do in sort of the information ops of retelling a narrative that can bind people and galvanize some of our best and brightest to want to work on American defense.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I think we're not making enough of how much good the U.S. military does in the world. So part of that narrative is how much of our effort is spent on keeping the world safe, whether that's freedom of navigation around the world or the humanitarian assistance we provide. We're the first on the ground whenever there's a disaster in the world, providing what we can from the U.S. military. So I think that's part of the narrative. Of course, the other part of the narrative is the Communist Party of China is a pretty repressive regime. Fortunately, that's getting a little more visibility these days. But I'd like to just add, relative to the Google Project Maven experience, we're not seeing that as representative. We're working with lots of companies who are trying to now work with the Defense Department and hopefully making that easier for them to do so. But we're seeing no shortage of companies that want to work with us. The last solicitation we did for an AI project had 60 companies applying. So I'm happy to tell you that I think while very regrettable, the Project Maven Google story, which was well publicized, is significant for what that represents and how we need to change that. I don't think that's representative of how Silicon Valley or the other innovation hubs feel about defense. And then relative to China, I think what I take from the graph that we looked at is two things. One, the US military is a lot smaller as a percentage of R&D going forward. If we went a little bit earlier than that chart to 1960, 30% of global R&D was associated with the US military. So that 30% has gone at the end of the period to 3%. So that just underscores the need for where the conversation started. The military has to reach out and access the technologies being developed commercially. And here's where China does have something that we need to pay attention to. They're not using the Soviet model of centralized planning, but they're using market incentives along with their repressive political regime at the top with ultimate control. But they're doing a very smart thing in building a very successful global economy. So we got to recognize that their game is not about R&D for just the military. It's all about economic prosperity for China. And they'd like to basically hollow out our industrial capacity as they do that. That's the dangerous trend and part of the narrative we've got to tell, that we can't let our technology companies basically play into that narrative.
And we went from Vannevar Bush to being warned of a military-industrial complex, and there was an aversion for that, in commerce circles. But I mean, China is a military-industrial complex, and the point about the reach. I mean, I banned a year and a half ago TikTok as an app in my house because I just knew that my kids, 3 kids, are going to be using it, and facial recognition, everything is going back to the CCP.
So it begs the question, Lisa, how is the DoD thinking about this, and also this idea of spurring innovation, R&D dollars? What does that mean in terms of public-private partnerships? And also, what does it mean, I guess, from a DoD perspective in terms of the rules of the road around some of these new technologies?
Rules of the road need to change, and you heard it today, whether it was Admiral Gilday, even Jeff Bezos' perspective. What came up over and over again is speed, and I think that is something that we need to really focus on, is that speed and that agility. I think the word that was used was nimble, but let's not also overlook the need to be able to scale, and scale in a rapid way. So those are some of the things that we're focused on in changing the way we do things. And again, that's where the reform piece of it comes in. Looking at our processes, number one, do we need them? Are some of them great opportunities to just get rid of them? And that goes for policies too. I'm not just looking at the process side. Then how do we optimize? And then any chance we get, can we automate? So being able to streamline and pick up and increase that speed, but also design for scalability, I think becomes an imperative.
All right. So one of the other things I didn't mention earlier, but in terms of VC investment 101, liquidity event is how you an exit basically is how you realize gains in an investment. So that could be a share purchase, acquisition or takeover. It could also be a company going public, an IPO, direct listing, increasingly becoming part of the conversation as well. Peter, I'll put this question to you, given the fact that we do have some, albeit just a couple, but some startups starting to take on more of this national security business. We're certainly seeing companies that are staying private for longer, but whether it's SpaceX, whether it's Palantir, which was started in 2004, are these companies, or Palantir specifically, is this a company that will go public? And I guess, is the time frame in terms of one of those exit strategies the same, or is it elongated when you're talking about defense?
I think it's super elongated in Silicon Valley generally at this point. This is sort of an enormous shift that happened after the 1990s, where the 1990s and the dot-com bubble, everyone tried to take companies public, put them on the stock market as fast as possible. And then, in the aftermath, you want sort of very profitable businesses that are at significant scale. There's a lot more regulation around having a public company. And so I think there's sort of, I think in general, it has gotten elongated tremendously. It's probably not quite as urgent for companies to go public. There's plenty of capital available on the private markets to fund these companies over the years. But yes, there's for both SpaceX and Palantir, there's ultimately some kind of IPO exit at some point in the future. You can create liquidity programs for early investors, for employees. So it's not as though everybody's had to hold the shares for 15 years since the company was started in 2004. But I think I always think one of the challenges with taking companies public is that you can sort of think it's always this danger in a tech company for it to become too overly bureaucratized. And in a public company, the accounting people, the legal people become far more powerful, and you can sort of think of it as like a sort of a coup by the accountants and the lawyers. And so if you're still like innovating very fast and very hard, you may want to try to defer the point at which that coup takes place.
Josh, I'll put the same question to you. How do you think about it as an investor in these types of companies?
Liquidity.
Yeah.
We want it.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think there's typically, by the way, venture capital funds are 10 years. So I actually think that, there's lots of different advantages you can have as an investor. You can have an informational advantage. I know something that you don't know. That's very hard when there's so many smart people. I can have an analytical advantage. Peter and I both look at the same piece of information. He analyzes it better than I do. He's got an analytic advantage. Also very hard with, both computers and really smart people. But the one real edge you can have as an investor is a behavioral one. And I'm going to make an analogy in a moment to how I think this applies to military as well. But for us, that means having a longer time horizon, what we call time arbitrage, than the average investor. And so if the average investor is looking at the .com or the e-commerce marketplace that's going to give them a signal that this is going to be a success in a year or two, and we're looking at something that might not give us a signal for 4 or 5 or 6 years, by definition, there are going to be fewer investors looking to fund the very thing that we're funding. And so the valuations of those things will be lower. And if we are right, the returns for our investors and us will be higher. So we like to actually look at things that are further out, which also means that they're riskier and more improbable to work. But when they do, we expect that they're going to work in a really big way. The analogy I was going to make to the military is in the same regard, taking those long-term views, but being able to think about technologies that are early today, being developed by these cutting-edge engineers that can really give, again, technological advantage. And so, just observing in theater and at Air Force bases, I've seen people that can paint a laser target in 5 seconds on the ground, and it takes 5 minutes for them to save an email, because of the classification systems that they have and the IT that's so outdated. I've seen a B-2 bomber at Whiteman Air Force Base and sat inside and watched as we got a blue screen of death from Windows NT that was operating it. I was floored. And so part of me was very scared, and I did a briefing at the Pentagon, and I said, if I was actually a mean-spirited, negatively intended adversary, I would actually plant inside the Pentagon an IT operations director that basically has the exact system that you guys have today, and as a means of sabotage. And it was scary. And I think if and this is one of the things that Mike is doing, but if you get more people from the Pentagon coming to Silicon Valley and seeing the speed at which people operate, the speed at which information flows, the systems and how agile they are, I think they will look with envy and say, my God, how are they able to do that? And I think that will lead to faster adoption, which again will lead to faster adoption of technologies that will give advantage.
I think it's probably a great idea to come and do the look-see, but I will tell you, Chief Data Officer reports into my organization, and we've just decided rather than go look, we'll start recruiting. And I have to say it's been fun. We're a little bit of a startup within DoD, so that's exciting to them. And we look at some of our mid-career data scientists, for example, who are looking for something and stretch their skills, and we recruit them by advertising. If you want to work on one of the most complex sets of problems, we've got them in spades, come on over. And so we're actually recruiting from Silicon Valley to work in some of our organizations, and that's been a huge eye-opener where a lot of people are very intrigued by what they're used to and how they work, and that those questions and those conversations are really starting to percolate within DoD.
Mike, you sort of bridged both worlds, not only in terms of the job you have now within the DoD, but also the fact that you were the CEO of a major tech company, Symantec, beforehand. What do you see as the biggest challenges in terms of bridging the two cultures together? How are they different? How are they similar?
Well, first of all, I would say, with credit to Ash Carter for starting DIU, the experiment is working. So we've been able to start 60 projects. We've finished 30 of them. We've delivered about a dozen new capabilities to the military using cutting-edge commercial technology. So I think contract values somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion. Those companies have in turn been able to raise more venture capital. We've seen a ratio of 10 to 1. For every dollar we provide in a prototype contract, on average, $10 of equity capital is raised. We just need more volume in this to get the flywheel effect going. But back to your question about what are the biggest challenges. The biggest challenge I see is, frankly, money and how it flows. So I don't think it's a question of folks from the military seeing things they want if they come to Silicon Valley. But it's really in the realm of what Lisa's trying to do and the work with Congress. So we have to start now on what the military wants for FY22. We have no budget for FY20 that we're in right now. And this was talked about by the Secretary as well as Adam Smith and Mac Thornberry. This is a big constraint to our readiness and being capable as a military. But imagine any business now trying to plan line items of what you're going to spend in fiscal year 22. We have to move faster. So Lisa and I have talked about this. It's going to take some work with Congress. That's the single biggest impediment. When we have a successful prototype that we're ready to scale and the military customer says, let's go, if they haven't planned for that line item and had that approved by Congress 2 years in advance, they can't scale that. And it's impossible to work at the speed of today's technology if you need a 2-year lead time and you got to be managing that level of granularity. So there's a new way we need to think if we're want to compete with a competitor like China that can move very fast. I don't want their system, but they can move very fast because of the central control. So we can compete effectively and give the capabilities that need to be in the hands of warfighters.
Yeah, so I think just coming back to the R&D chart you had earlier, I don't think it's necessary for the U.S. military to go back to doing 30% of the R&D spend globally.
Agreed.
But if we're not going to do that, we have to reform the procurement process. So it's okay for us to outsource the part of the R&D to venture capital, to Silicon Valley, to other parts of the private sector. But that's only going to work if the procurement process gets reformed, and then there's a pathway for this to happen. There's no shortage of venture capital generally. We live in a world where central banks have been printing money for 10 years. We have $20 trillion of bonds that have negative yields. There's no shortage of venture capital, but there is not that much being put into sort of military defense companies, because we all have this look-ahead function where it's going to be slow. If it's dual use, well, we better focus on the commercial. We don't know how fast the military will happen, and it's like always this race. And if you can get something in 6 months on the commercial side, and the military side might take 3 years. Even if you get it down to 2 years, you're still going to focus on the commercial side. And so there's So I think Silicon Valley, it's not just ideological or myopic. There is a certain part of it where it's a rational look-ahead function that people have.
I just want to add, though, to the point Peter's making. There's been a lot of work done on procurement. So I think the work that needs to be done now is on budgeting. And this is where Congress comes into play. So there's a lot more flexibility than is known on the procurement side. And DIU is an example of that. We use something called Other Transaction Authority. So we can move faster on the procurement. But if you don't have the budget in place, there's no dollars from the comptroller moving to say you can do that.
Josh, you look like you wanted to.
No, I was just going to say in both cases that speed is an advantage. And whether it's the flow of money or it's the ease of procurement, we can just be massively advantaged by removing the friction in both those processes. And more importantly, because what Peter said is really important, the incentive is there from private capital. We are roaring to put more money to work. The incentive is there from the entrepreneurs and the engineers. They are roaring to develop and to serve military, in some cases exclusively military. They're totally comfortable doing that. The incentive has to be there from the government to say we want to pull this stuff through so that we can be advantaged and doing it with as least friction as possible.
All right. I know we're going to be opening this up to Q&A here. So I'm just going to take that. Thank you. All right. we've got a couple questions here. Let's see if we can get through them all. Could larger traditional defense primes just acquire startups? Oh, this is a good question. To harness their tech and human capital, much like other big tech companies such as Google do with startups?
They certainly could, but in some cases, the entrepreneurs have grander ambitions. And there's a lot of people that don't want to sell to Facebook or don't want to sell to a Lockheed or a Raytheon because they think that their job isn't done and they've got another 10 years to grow and they want the freedom to do that. So in some cases it does make sense, but in other cases I think the most ambitious entrepreneurs are going to stay private, and we should give them the capital and the runway to take off.
There's always there are all these advantages larger scale companies have. When I started PayPal years ago, very different context, I was always asked, why can't a big bank just do this? And I never had a good answer to that, because in theories the banks have scale, they can have longer time horizons, they have more capital, they have a lot of talent. And I think the general answer is that it's just the internal politics are unbelievably bad. And this is true not just of large parts of the government, it's also true of a lot of large corporations become incredibly politicized in ways that are not good for innovation. So I think you can acquire a technology company at that point where you don't need to innovate anymore. So if it's a fully formed thing, maybe that's a point at which it makes sense for the primes to acquire them. But if you still need to maintain that culture of innovation, that's going to be very hard to do.
Follow the people. The old quote from Walter Wriston, capital goes where it's welcome and stays where it's well treated. Think of that as human capital too. Rarely do I ever hear in a high growth, successful or succeeding company, this thing is just moving too fast for me. I really, I want to go into a slower moving thing. But so often I have resumes coming in from big companies where people are saying, it's just really frustrating and it's so political and, I just want something fresh and exciting. So yeah, it is the politics.
It's interesting though, Mike, because we have seen a lot of consolidation within defense and aerospace in the last couple of years, and at a time where I think a lot of people didn't think we could have another wave, but it hasn't really involved acquisitions of tech companies. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, I'm not sure about you, I agree with the question. I think there has involved some tech companies, and the primes continue to do acquisition. I think that is one exit path, but I think we heard what some of the pitfalls can be from that. So, and then we've also seen some new age companies that want to work with defense, like Anduril, getting funded, which I think is an incredibly positive trend.
All right. How do you address the risk of tech startups and national security being influenced by Chinese or other foreign national-backed VC firms? What is being done to ensure our adversaries are not infiltrating these startups through financial leverage? Who wants to take that? Okay.
This is what really brought me to this work, an assignment from Ash Carter to say, what are the Chinese doing in early stage investment? And what we found was shocking to me, and I think to Congress and to the Pentagon. So in 2015, Chinese investors, there's 500 different investing firms affiliated with China, were in 15% of all our venture capital deals in the US. Imagine that vantage point to looking at the innovation space in the US. And if you looked at if you invested in 15%, how many do you think they looked at? So they could have looked at a multiple of that. There's no way we're going to have an offset or a overmatch if our potential adversaries at the table learning about the technology at the same time we are. So I'm glad to say there's been some work done by Congress. One of the things that's been done with bipartisan support, passing of FIRMA, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, not popular with my venture capital friends, but this gives CFIUS more jurisdiction to look at much more than straight up acquisitions, other ways technology could be transferred and to have some blocking power. Similarly, there was an Export Control Reform Act that was passed in 2018. But the rules for those are still being written, so there's really been no effective change from that picture we looked at in 2016, 2017. We have to wait for the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, which heads up CFIUS, to get their machinery in place with rules and regs so that we can have a better way to protect. But at the same time, we can't be focused on the protection. We got to be focused on what are we doing to invest in our own economy? What's happening with federal funded R&D, STEM education, calling for moonshots in these game-changing technologies. So there's a lot more we need to do to invest in ourselves to make sure we got the vibrant commercial companies that allow us to have economic prosperity and national security.
All right, we got one more question and we got one more minute. So here we go. How did government interests in IP rights and government regulations limiting profit impact venture capital? Want me to read it again?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's the main. I think the biggest problems are the ones we've talked about, which is just procurement, budgeting, a fast way to ramp up and scale these businesses, and that if we solve those, we will have solved, the vast bulk of the challenges we have.
And making concentrated big bets. I mean, that's what we do. We make big concentrated bets. It's okay to make a few bets, but then once you see something is going to take off, really, put the heft behind it and give it the push, particularly if we're going to discourage foreign capital from coming in. I think it's absolutely imperative.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it there with 18 seconds to go. Thank you all for joining me on stage and for a very insightful panel. Appreciate it.
Thank you.